Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Chicken Movies, and today we are going to be going through the top 5 worst Jodie Whittaker Doctor Who episodes. This is the second part to my 13th Doctor video series, the first of which went through her best stories, and I'd strongly suggest checking this one out too, but obviously after you've watched this one. And it's also part of a much bigger Doctor Who top 5 series, where I'm getting a bit stuck now because I've only got Doctors with very short tenures left, so look forward to my top 3 14th Doctor episodes, I guess. Spoiler alert, the second best is also the second worst. But no, with this tenure, there are at least going to be enough stories for me to be able to say I definitively like 5 stories and dislike 5 stories. I can't believe I'm having to say this, but this video consists of my own opinions, and any two-parters will be combined into... And it's also part of a much bigger... However, I'm interested in hearing what the rest of you guys think. What are your top 5 least favourite 13th Doctor stories? And let me know in those comments down below. Once again, I want to thank Veritaserum UK for the fan-made trailers that I'm using in this video. But before we get properly into it, here are a few honourable or dishonourable mentions. The Halloween Apocalypse, the Ghost Monument, and Survivors of the Flux. And now, without further ado, let's get into the video. So at number 5 we have the only two-parter in Jodie Whittaker's tenure, which kind of gave away that this would be on the list, and this story isn't actually that bad, but it commits several cardinal sins that warranted its place on the list. There's an obvious amount of controversy surrounding this story relating to the big timeless child reveal, and if you want my 2 cents, I'm not a fan of making the Doctor a Chosen One-esque character, especially not for the sake of just answering questions that very few people were asking, and as a result it left even more questions open that the series never properly answered. Surrounding this, it failed to have any real impact on anything. We already know that the Time Lords suck, so they killed them off, which felt very lazy, and this reveal didn't really do anything to develop the Doctor or the Master's characters or their relationship with each other. So when you build an entire episode, or rather season, around this one bit of lore, you'd like it to have a huge impact on either the characters or the story, and it does neither. But my problems with this story aren't just the big reveal. I hate this version of the Cybermen passionately. The design of Ashad looks awful, and the idea of a half-human, half-Cyberman leading the Cybermen just doesn't really make sense given everything we know about Cybermen, and seeing an emotional Cyberman is weird as well. So to compensate, the remaining Cybermen are way too robotic, with goofy flying head drones, Graham and Yaz hiding inside cybersuits with no trouble. Okay, they do briefly mention that there are bodies in there, but then all of a sudden they have no problem getting in the suits anyway. Worst of all, the Cybermen are trying to become fully robotic, and they have this death particle, which is really out of character too, and as a side note, is it just me or do the Cyberheads sound like TIE fighters? The Master's inclusion feels very shoehorned into this story, with him comically popping out of a portal to say, "Be afraid, Doctor, everything's about to change." Unfortunately, it doesn't. And while Sacha Dhawan is having a lot of fun in his performance, he's given very little to do other than give exposition and overact basically every scene. He acts like the Joker with Tourette's and flip-flops with his allegiances and what his actual goals are, to the point where I was pretty confused. Which brings me back to the decision to kill off the Time Lords. Again. As a side note, I find it really funny that after a whole season, Gallifrey's still burning, but having the Master kill them off screen felt incredibly cheap and spoiled for a far more interesting storyline down the road. They also show this Irish guy subplot in the first part, which is a parallel to the Doctor's past, and whilst I like that it's being really artsy here, it doesn't really fit the rest of the story, and its implication isn't made very clear. Apparently these are mental projections of deep-seated memories from the Doctor, but this is only communicated to us after the Timeless Child reveal the next episode, so why show those scenes at all? Because, to be honest, the rest of the story is very half-baked. I can't remember the names of any of the side characters, and where each of their stories go can be summarised in a couple sentences. Barristan Selmy is in this episode, and I quite liked him, mostly because I like his character in Game of Thrones. Wait, is that Corlys? No way. Next you'll be telling me that the Human Man is in Game of Thrones too. Unfortunately, aside from give exposition and die, Barristan doesn't get much to do this episode. They try for an emotional sacrifice, but we spend very little time with this character to care. And also, it doesn't help that Ashad and the Cyber Time Lords and the Master all survive, so his death was kind of for nothing. Not the first time, Selmy? This episode also falls victim to excessive monologuing from pretty much everyone, and it sounds really unnatural. A lot of the dialogue just doesn't sound right. Even Ashad did some really strange monologuing at the start of the episode, which was pretty cringe. But it wasn't the cringiest moment of the episode. That goes to the Doctor just deciding to break free of the Matrix to the Doctor Who theme, which might be the most embarrassing thing in Doctor Who since Dimensions in Time. So look, I don't like what they did, or rather didn't do, with the characters, and I'm not fond of some of the reveals here. So where I did like the visuals a decent amount, the script sadly outweighs any positives I may have. Which is why these two episodes just cracked the top 5. At number 4 we have the Saranga Conundrum, and it's hard to find a real summary of this episode, it kinda just sucks. And this episode is really heavily focused on the Doctor, and I'm sorry to say that I found her super annoying this episode. It's weird that so much of this alien environment is shown from the Doctor's perspective as opposed to the companions who just wander around looking bored for most of the episode, but the Doctor spends the majority of this episode babbling about tangential stuff, and this dialogue isn't funny, it doesn't really move the plot around, and I guess you could say that it characterizes the Doctor, but it doesn't have to be so in your face with lines which are basically just screaming, "I'm quirky," with very little depth or nuance. In fact, all of this story has very little depth, and generally it just feels flat. I get what they're going for with it being a sterile medical ship, but the side effect of a sterile and clean set is that visually it makes the episode look very dull, and unfortunately the camera work isn't anywhere near creative enough to compensate. Take for example the scene of Ryan telling Yaz about his parents. The actors look bored. They're stood still in a grey set and we get generic shot reverse shot. It just feels so empty of emotion. This episode just doesn't have any atmosphere, which applies to the villain too, which, as a surprise, literally only wants one thing and is incredibly basic and generic in its goals. I kinda like the Pating. His design is goofy and I find it really funny whenever we get Pating cam of this guy causing mischief. However, I don't take it seriously as a threat at all. You know it's kinda bad when 15 minutes in a main character is killed in an explosion and I just burst out laughing. But no, they expect me to take it seriously. None of the side characters are interesting, there's a stupid side plot involving smuggling drugs between two characters that I do not care about. There's also a pregnant man, really progressive Chris, but the prop belly is pretty off-putting and it leads to way too many questions about anatomy that I didn't want to think about. And of course they play it off as a very serious and inspirational moment when he gives birth with the incredible line from Ryan of... The one positive I do have is that I kind of like the scene of the Doctor explaining the antimatter engine just because it seems like somebody in this episode genuinely wanted to be there. As well as that, the music sucks and at points sounds like it could be found on YouTube. Overall, this script just sucks. It has a confusing opening, bad dialogue, and it poorly communicates parts of a very simplistic plot. But it's not very fun. You see, this entire episode felt like a parody of Doctor Who, except nobody in production seemed to be in on the joke, and because of that, the joke was on me for watching this story again. At number 3 we have The Legend of the Sea Devils, and this episode was incomprehensible at points and reeked of rushed production. The directing is lazy and uninspired, where there are some cool visuals that largely come from VFX and look good, But in other scenes, there is no focus. Characters will sneak about with no way of establishing where they're hiding or what they're seeing. There are so many instances of things just happening randomly because they could not be bothered to establish the setting, the MacGuffins, or the characters. And even worse is the editing, which does its absolute best to distract the viewer and mask all of the poor direction. It's a shame because there's clearly good production value and good hair and makeup at points, and sometimes good cinematography, but we barely see it because of this awful editing. I was excited to see a swashbuckling pirates versus sea devils adventure, but none of the fight scenes are memorable because the directing and editing are just so bad. Okay, I don't actually know which it is. Is it the fault of the director for not thinking to show this stuff and the editor just has to clean it up? Or is it the fault of the editor for leaving out all of the good stuff? So I'll just say filmmaking from now on. The titular Sea Devils themselves look pretty good actually, with the exception of a pretty goofy jump at the start. They have some generic plot that I can't remember and some generic motivation that I can't remember, which is impressive because I watched this episode yesterday. But this is far from the only problem with the script. This story just has so many characters and plot lines that don't clearly link, and they're going on at a breakneck pace, to the point where it's honestly confusing. So to combat this, they resort to heavy exposition, where they just unnaturally tell you a load of stuff. It might as well be a Big Finish audio story with how much over-explaining they do. But is there anything I like? Well, there's a couple of good shots, the costumes are a breath of fresh air, and I like this joke from Dan.
Let me do the talking here.
There's some good music, but it's really awkwardly placed at points, and I also like how they explore 13 and Yaz's relationship. In like 3 scenes, but honestly, those are probably the 3 best scenes of the episode, because the rest of the episode is rushed. It's filled with characters we know nothing about, making decisions that don't feel earned, and MacGuffins popping in and out of the plot at will. And there's a load of techno jargon to Deus Ex Machina our conclusion. There is some good stuff, but an overwhelming amount of bad outweighs it. So I thought I'd spend the remainder of this section going through the stuff the writers don't explain. They never explain why there's a Sea Devil statue or why it comes to life. They never show a conveniently placed net for the Doctor to trap the Sea Devil. They never show Bad Hairline Guy's MacGuffin. They never explain why he's over Pirate Lady murdering his father. And most importantly, they never explain why we should care about the story. I certainly didn't, which is why an Antiques Roadshow rerun had more viewership than Legend of the Sea Devils. To say the least, it deserves its place at number 3. At number 2, we have Arachnids in the UK. What a bad episode title, by the way. This story tries to focus on its companions more, but since there are 3 of them, and like 3 other side characters, not a lot is really added to their characters with the exception of Graham, whose scenes with Grace are pretty nice, but sadly this is overshadowed by Jackson, who was so annoying this episode. This is very obviously a Trump parallel, and it's handled with no subtlety or depth beyond Trump bad. What his company does is very confusing. Apparently the same company makes its profits through a mixture of waste disposal and hotel management, but everyone still knows who the CEO is. All this guy does is constantly grind the episode to a halt to complain and say the most stereotypical Republican things, which everyone ignores. This episode is really repetitive and boring as a result of this. The spiders, aside from being mediocre CGI, aren't really scary and don't pose a particularly big threat. I know that you can't give a lot of characterization with spiders, but at the end they try to make the spiders somewhat pitiful, and it falls flat because they are just CGI spiders. The directing is pretty weak, with characters just stood around statically in some scenes, and overall the episode had a dull grey colour palette with very flat lighting that at points even shone directly into the camera lens. Even the time vortex, which was cool looking conceptually, also looked grey and dark. The pacing was very uneven and slow, and filled with out-of-place dialogue and dumb technobabble to explain the very loose plot. But for me, it's the episode's conclusion where it really falls apart. For starters, Stormzy saves the day, and I'm not entirely sure how. Then the characters just stumble upon the Queen Spider, who's suffocating because she's too big, I guess, and then Jackson shoots the dying spider. The Doctor's morals here are really strange, where essentially she'd rather see a creature die painfully than be murdered quickly. I don't know what the message they were even going for is, but they make it out like Jackson is the bad guy here, and that the Doctor's idea of letting this creature die painfully was somehow better. It was hard placing this episode on this list because I don't really have much to say about it, but what tipped this episode over the edge is just how boring and dull this story is. There are many faults with this episode warranting its spot, however, it still isn't as bad as the number one choice. And the worst 13th Doctor episode is Orphan 55. Where to begin with this story? So many things are wrong with this episode that I don't think I can cover it all in one video, but I'll try my best. We start with a really awkward TARDIS scene and some very forced dialogue of, "Oh, you seem moody, Doctor, let's go to a spa." And we're immediately whisked off to the spa resort, but we spend very little time here. There are only like 3 sets of this place, and the whole place just feels very small and underdeveloped, because only 5 minutes in and a monster is unleashed and wreaks havoc, killing every single unnamed character in the location, and I do not care at all when it happens. The directing is kind of terrible in these sequences. They do a really weird trick where the lights will flicker and actors will look at something off camera, run away, and then they'll jump cut to a stupidly close shot of the monsters with completely different lighting. They do this several times, and the only thing that I can think of is that the guys in rubber suits weren't actually on set. But it's really off-putting, and to say the least, these scenes have practically no tension, and because of that, it's actually really funny. Some of the character designs are also terrible. The cat lady's design is hideous, the green wigs that Jay and his son have to wear look so fake, and the oxygen stickers that people put on their noses just look goofy. We have a massive overabundance of characters this episode, none of which I cared about. I still can't figure out the purpose that Jay's son had to the story. The anarchist daughter subplot was cheesy as hell and underdeveloped as well, and I found the old people pretty annoying. They never explained why the monsters were using the old guy as a hostage, and the old lady's sacrifice felt very out of the blue. They try for this very paint-by-numbers story involving a secret daughter who's an anarchist against her mother's business, and they have an even more conventional subplot of a romance with Ryan that doesn't feel earned at all. Pretty much every single character death happened off-screen as well, so we're just told about it, or it's implied, to the point where I was half expecting a reveal that the characters all survived, only for them to then pull that trick at the laziest possible moment to bring an even lazier conclusion to the stupid mother-daughter storyline. The furry lady's death scene is really funny. For some reason, she takes way longer to escape than everyone else, and it's shown through badly rushed editing and ADR dialogue, and then they get outside and she dies off screen and there's just one dreg outside and it doesn't bother chasing them. It's hilarious. The pacing of the story is all over the place and uneven, with way too many characters and plot lines, none of which it develops properly, but it still tries with all of them, which makes half of these scenes incredibly boring and the other half hilarious. And visually, this episode is grey and overlit the entire runtime. There is absolutely no artistry to this episode, and it clearly only serves one purpose and cares about one thing. And that is this big message about climate change, which is handled with absolutely no nuance and no subtlety. There is one hint that this planet is Earth, and that hint is so obvious, and it makes the message of the story so obvious. But as the rest of the episode progresses, they keep hitting you over the head with this idea that is not that creative. And no, It gets worse, because the Doctor mentally gets a vision of climate change from the monster, who I guess remembers climate change, and she then tells the companions immediately and delivers this information in such a ham-fisted way, and it still keeps going, because after the episode is done and dusted, she then goes and lectures the audience watching the episode, basically repeating everything just to make sure us babies understood the message. It could not be more in your face. And in an episode that was so devoid of personality in its storytelling, it just comes across as incredibly preachy. The Doctor herself is very preachy in this episode, where the plot will just come to a halt and the Doctor will just monologue questions and answers for the audience that they weren't really asking, but it feels very unnatural whenever she has these moments. Some other notes that I have: there's a scene of Ryan getting a virus, which was very pointless, and feels very anti the tone of the rest of the episode. I love how the Doctor tries to reason with a mindless creature, but then it actually works. I love that soldiers are clearly just shooting at nothing when the monsters show up, or rather, don't show up. I hate how many characters do stupid things the entire episode with no consequences, just because the plot needs things to happen. And I found the final shot of the monsters growling after the Doctor's speech to be hilarious. If you want to know why it took me so long to make this video, it's because it took me 3 attempts to watch Orphan 55. That's how embarrassingly bad this episode is. Legitimately, everything possible was wrong, which is why it is the worst 13th Doctor episode. And there we have it. The 5 worst Jodie Whittaker stories. Now, I'm going to go watch City of Death again to actually feel something again. Thank you everyone for watching this video. What are your least favourite Jodie Whittaker Doctor Who episodes? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to check out my other Doctor Who videos linked below in the description. But for the time being, thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like and comment. And I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.